can't really hear what Jeremy says because I got my 2 Stanley Cup rings plugged in my ear.
What does true dominance look like in the NHL? Not just good numbers on a stat sheet or flashy saves for the highlight reel, but the kind of career that forces the entire sport to change forever. In the modern era of hockey, one name sits at the center of that conversation. Patrick Roy. Nicknamed St. Patrick, he wasn't just a goalie, he was a phenomenon. From carrying the Montreal Canadiens to an improbable cup run as a rookie, to putting the Colorado Avalanche on the map, to redefining the very way goalies play the position, Roy's prime years weren't just good, they were era-defining. But here's the real question, was Patrick Roy truly the greatest goaltender of his generation, or have the myths of time exaggerated his dominance? And just as important, how would prime Roy look if he were dropped straight into today's NHL, facing the fastest, most skilled shooters the game has ever seen? Patrick Roy's story begins in Sainte-Foy, Quebec, where hockey was less of a sport and more of a way of life. Unlike most kids who dreamed of scoring goals, Roy was drawn to the crease. He once admitted that he picked the position for a surprisingly simple reason: the gear looked cool. That shallow decision quickly became an obsession. While other kids were ripping pucks into backyard nets, Roy was experimenting with ways to stop them. He was unknowingly developing the foundation of what would become the most influential goaltending style in NHL history, the butterfly. By his teens, he wasn't just keeping games close, he was stealing them outright. Coaches marveled at his confidence, his positioning, and his ability to intimidate opponents even before the puck dropped. Still, Roy was far from a sure bet. Drafted 51st overall by the Canadiens in 1984, he was considered risky, even unorthodox. But what the scouts saw as flaws were actually the signs of a revolution. The turning point came in 1986. At just 20 years old, Roy was thrust into the Montreal net for the playoffs. The pressure was enormous. Montreal wasn't just another hockey market, it was a city that demanded championships. Most rookies would have cracked. Roy didn't. He delivered one of the most remarkable playoff performances in NHL history. He won 15 games, posted a 1.92 goals against average in an era where scoring was rampant, and carried an underdog Canadiens roster all the way to the Stanley Cup. At the end of it all, he became the youngest player ever to win the Conn Smythe Trophy as playoff MVP. Overnight, he went from a promising rookie to St. Patrick, the miracle worker who turned skepticism into awe. Patrick Roy didn't just stop pucks, he transformed the very blueprint of goaltending. Before him, the stand-up style was the norm. Goalies stayed on their feet as much as possible, reacting with quick kicks of the pads or relying on glove saves. The position was rooted in reflexes and improvisation, with very little structure. Roy threw that tradition aside. He dropped to his knees, spread his pads across the ice, and sealed off the bottom of the net. He used angles to shrink shooting lanes, relying on positioning as much as pure reaction. What seemed unorthodox at first soon revealed itself as a calculated system, one that made shooters second guess and forced them into lower percentage plays. This butterfly style didn't just work, it revolutionized the position. Through the late 1980s, while offenses were exploding across the league, Roy consistently posted elite numbers despite facing heavy workloads. He routinely saw 30 to 35 shots a night and still found ways to keep Montreal competitive. His ability to combine athletic reflexes with technical precision set him apart from nearly every other goalie of his era. It wasn't only his technique that made him dangerous, it was his presence. Roy carried himself with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, and it rattled opponents. He stared down shooters, never flinching, and made saves look easier than they had any right to be. Coaches praised his poise, teammates fed off his intensity, and opponents quietly admitted that sometimes he got into their heads before the puck was even dropped. In an era where goalies were often seen as eccentric background players, Roy elevated the position into something entirely different, the backbone of a championship team. The legend of Roy's prime truly crystallized in 1993. That spring, the Canadiens weren't supposed to be contenders. Their roster was solid, but no one expected a championship. Roy had other plans. He went on one of the most improbable playoff runs in history, winning 10 overtime games in a single postseason. 10. The pressure of sudden death is almost unbearable, yet Roy thrived under it. One of the most iconic moments of his career came during that run when he made a huge save in the final against the Los Angeles Kings and calmly winked at Thomas Sandstrom. That wasn't just a show of confidence, it was psychological warfare. The Kings knew they were beaten. Montreal lifted the cup, Roy claimed his second Conn Smythe, and the legend of St. Patrick grew even larger. Of course, no legendary career comes without controversy, and Patrick Roy's split with Montreal remains one of the most dramatic moments in NHL history. By the mid-1990s, the Canadiens were a shadow of their former selves, and tensions were already simmering between Roy and the organization. Everything came to a boiling point on December 2nd, 1995, in a game against the powerhouse Detroit Red Wings. On that night, Roy was left in the net far too long, surrendering 9 goals as the Forum crowd jeered. Humiliated and furious, he skated off the ice, went straight to team president Ronald Corey, and told him in no uncertain terms that he had played his last game in a Canadiens uniform. It wasn't just frustration, it was the breaking of a bond between a superstar and the city that had worshipped him. 4 days later, the Canadiens dealt him in a blockbuster trade to the Colorado Avalanche. Critics at the time wondered if Montreal had gotten rid of him at the right time, questioning whether his best days were already behind him. But Roy didn't just silence those doubts, he obliterated them. In his very first season in Colorado, he became the backbone of a new franchise and carried them all the way to the Stanley Cup. The defining moment of that run came in Game 4 of the final against the Florida Panthers. It was triple overtime, the kind of marathon game that drains even the best players. The Panthers were fighting for their season, throwing everything they had at the net. Roy faced 63 shots that night. He turned aside every single one of them. A 1-0 shutout in triple overtime to clinch the cup for Colorado. It wasn't just a performance, it was a statement. Roy hadn't just rebounded from humiliation in Montreal, he had reasserted himself as the most clutch goaltender in the world, and he had done it on hockey's biggest stage. By the late 1990s, Roy was already regarded as one of the greatest goalies ever, but in 2001, at 35 years old, he delivered one of the finest seasons of his career. He posted 40 wins, captured the Jennings Trophy, and led Colorado to another Stanley Cup. Even more impressive, he won his 3rd Conn Smythe Trophy, making him the only goalie to claim playoff MVP in 3 different decades. Most goaltenders begin to fade as they age. Roy wasn't just surviving, he was still dominating. It was proof that his prime wasn't limited to a few short years. He sustained greatness across nearly 2 decades. The statistics back it up. When he retired, Roy held the NHL record with 551 regular season wins. He added 151 playoff victories, more than many entire franchises. He was selected to 11 All-Star games, won 3 Vezina trophies, 5 Jennings, and 4 Stanley Cups. He made the playoffs in 17 straight seasons. Even in his final year, when most goalies limp to the finish line, he posted 35 wins and a .914 save percentage. For many, that would be the peak of a career. For Roy, it was simply his farewell. But numbers only tell part of the story. Roy reshaped what it meant to be a goaltender. Before him, the position was seen as secondary, played by quiet, quirky figures in the shadows. Roy made goaltending cool. He made it about swagger, confidence, and leadership. His butterfly style became the template for every young goalie. His mental toughness set the standard for what it meant to be clutch. And his personality made him more than a last line of defense. He was a franchise cornerstone. Every goalie since, from Carey Price to Marc-Andre Fleury, carries echoes of Patrick Roy's influence. That brings us to the fun question every fan loves to debate. What if you dropped prime Patrick Roy into today's NHL? The game has changed dramatically since his glory years. Today's shooters are faster, stronger, and far more creative. Offensive systems are built on speed and puck movement, designed to pull goalies out of position. Training regimens are hyper-specialized, with video analysis breaking down tendencies in ways Roy's generation never imagined. Modern goaltenders are often towering figures, 6'4", 6'5" athletes with perfect mechanics, flawless technique, and equipment that makes them look like armored walls in the crease. On paper, it's easy to think that a 6-foot-tall goalie from the 1980s might look outdated in today's league. But here's the truth, Patrick Roy's edge was never just his size or even his reflexes. It was his mentality. Roy thrived in pressure moments that break most players. He lived for sudden death overtime, relished hostile arenas, and elevated his play when everything was on the line. That competitive fire doesn't go out of style, and it certainly doesn't get neutralized by better skaters or bigger pads. If you put Roy in today's NHL with access to modern training, nutrition, and goalie coaching, there's little doubt he would adapt. The same obsessive drive that made him refine the butterfly into a weapon would push him to evolve alongside the game. Imagine Roy studying hours of video like today's goalies do, or training with the same biomechanics experts that sharpen a Vasilevsky or a Shesterkin. The results would be terrifying. terrifying. Of course, it's fair to say that today's Giants might have a natural edge in raw coverage of the net. Vasilevsky's 6'3" frame, Hellebuyck's consistency, or Shesterkin's blend of agility and positioning are remarkable by any standard, but the question isn't whether Roy could match their frame, it's whether they could match his mental toughness. Would they win 10 straight overtime games in a single playoff run, the way Roy did in 1993? Would they wink at an opponent in the middle of the Stanley Cup final and instantly break their confidence? Those aren't just highlights, they're testaments to a mindset few goalies in history have possessed. Roy's prime wasn't built on gimmicks or luck, it was built on competitiveness, swagger, and an obsession with winning. Those qualities are timeless. Drop him into 2025, give him the tools today's goalies have at their disposal, and he wouldn't just survive, he'd find a way to dominate, and just like he did in his own era, he'd probably leave shooters shaking their heads, wondering how in the world they were ever going to score. So how good was prime Patrick Roy actually? The numbers say historic, the moments say iconic, the influence says eternal. He wasn't just great for his era, his prime redefined goaltending itself. Every butterfly save made today traces back to him. Every goalie who carries himself with swagger owes him a debt, and every team that leans on their netminder in the biggest moments is following a path he carved. Even with all the advances in training, nutrition, and coaching, no one has matched his combination of dominance, longevity, and clutch performances. Patrick Roy's prime wasn't just good, it was the standard. And maybe the real question isn't whether he could dominate in today's NHL, but whether anyone, past or present, could truly outshine him in a Game 7 with everything on the line.